Man has shared these functions according to his nature with woman. She would have responsibility for the dress, fire, food, adornments, and child-rearing. The man with hunt and manufacture of weapons. One, the most important, marches forward with the liberty and independence of a leader. Everyone looks at him and surrounds him when he stops. Certainly, there would be a young man in love that would follow behind an elegant girl with a tanned face to offer her a taste of his fond affection, and she would offer a blushing glance to the gallant lover in all the science of love, that beyond these sentiments, humanity has not advanced. Archaeology, since its beginning as a science in the 19th century, included in its definition limitations about its possibilities. It was accepted that past societies could only be studied by their material remains, the objects. Moreover, it was assumed that the social relations did not leave a mark, and as a result, the past forms of social organization remained outside of the reach of verification. To represent prehistoric societies, archaeologists resorted to extant communities that were considered primitive and with analogous cultural development that identified behaviors presumed to be determined by biology, or some claimed common sense. This led to form the type of interpretations that we have listened to. The definition and limitations of archaeology have been internalized and accepted as intrinsic to the discipline. As a result of this, we basically continue to use ethnographic and ethologic analogies to understand past social relations. The only advance came from feminist anthropology, which in the 1970s demonstrated that neither the work nor the social relations between men and women are biologically determined. The scientific renovation of archaeology at the end of the 20th century was significant because of the adoption of new techniques like zooarchaeology, taphonomy, and ethnoarchaeology that, although they permit an improved understanding of subsistence activities, do not succeed in explaining the causes of social development other than to attribute them to environmental changes. To respond to questions like, have there been essential changes in society? It is necessary to understand how the social relations originated and what they were based, and how they were changed or maintained up to the present times. To understand these prehistoric origins, we can only rely on archaeology. This poses the questions: can archaeology really achieve this objective? Is the insufficiency based in the science of archaeology itself, or only in the acceptance of its traditional definition? As we parted from social archaeology, and we understood that there are social relations that define a society, we intended to respond to those questions. We began by evaluating the possibilities of the archaeological method, and to see if, by calibrating or modifying the basics, we would be able to overcome the barrier. With this objective, we set off for the Tierra del Fuego. We wanted to see if, beginning with archaeology, we could recompose the image of a society that we already knew about through ethnographic descriptions, and to see how the social production and reproduction were organized. In Tierra del Fuego, we were able to compare the known ethnographic image with what could be understood through the study of the archaeological record of the same people. We thought that previous knowledge of the social organization would permit us to test the pertinence of the archaeological questions and to develop an applied method to their resolution. We chose Tierra del Fuego because there was a large and varied ethnographic record. The people were always considered a paradigm for prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies. Being an island increased the value of our experiment by the insular isolation that permits better control of the variables. According to the ethnographic information, there coexisted at least 3 distinct ethnic groups on the island. This would permit us to analyze how the archaeological material varied between the 3 groups. There have been few environmental changes since the ethnographic period. We had the possibility to excavate locations that were occupied by the same people described ethnographically due to the presence of abundant visible archaeological sites with very good conservation. Thanks to the extensive previous archaeological work carried out since 1975 by our Argentine colleagues, we had information about the history of the zone from the first human occupation about 6,900 years ago. Beginning in 1986, we developed and carried out the first Spanish-Argentine research project on the coast of the Beagle Channel. The project first sought to obtain an ethnographic image that could later be contrasted with the archaeological record by using methods and techniques common to prehistoric archaeology. To achieve these objectives, we first compiled all of the written and graphic ethnographic information. We studied the main collections of ethnographic objects housed in European museums using the same methods that are implemented to analyze the objects found in archaeological excavations. The ethnographic image obtained through a critical synthesis of the data was reinforced with computer models of artificial intelligence and neural networks. These permitted the data to be evaluated objectively. Studying the human remains in the collections of the museums, we were able at the same time to establish a bioanthropological characterization to look for possible differences between the original population.
Los estudios biológicos que se han llevado a cabo sobre los aborígenes de Tierra del Fuego han permitido establecer las relaciones filogenéticas entre los distintos grupos, conocer su dieta, valorar el grado de presión ambiental soportada y conocer su proceso de extinción.
The multivariate study of 230 crania and the analysis of mitochondrial DNA points more to functional differences than to different lineages between the indigenous groups. The next step was to confront that image with the image derived from an excavated archaeological site that corresponds to the time period of contact with Europeans. The selected site, like most of them in this zone, was formed mainly by accumulations of consumed shellfish remains. To adapt ourselves to this type of site, it was necessary to develop and implement new techniques, as well as to readjust and eliminate others. Our methodology incorporated a complete program of experimental, designed and directed to understand the processes of work whose existence we were documenting through the excavation. Likewise, to better understand how the sites were formed, it was necessary to carry out taphonomic studies to identify the processes that affected the archaeological remains once they were abandoned. The system of excavation, sampling and analysis undertaken allowed the identification of a series of superimposed hearths at Tunnel 7. These marked at least 10 brief occupations in the same place. There, people had constructed and reconstructed a hut from the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. This repetition permitted us to recognize how they organized their living space, the recurrences, and the significant variation on the archaeological remains. We were able to analyze the dominant line in the management of resources and how they varied within the same environment. However, the conclusions reached could not be representative, but simply a consequence of local or conjunctural phenomena. In order to generalize, we should be able to know the spectrum of normal variability within the same social group. What potential differences would there be if we moved to another site, to another biome, even inside of the same northern coast of the Beagle Channel, a site occupied by the same people but with different possibilities of access to resources? This motivated us to a new project that was supported by the European Union. In addition to the microenvironmental variables, we evaluated the impact of climatic oscillations as factors of change as opposed to social factors. To contrast the hypothesis suggested from earlier campaigns, we began an extensive survey program that identified and sampled more than 100 sites. To test pits served us by providing absolute dates and isotopic samples which were used to construct a curve of the ocean's paleotemperatures over the last 6,000 years. The study of the samples correlated with the results of previous work, allowed us to understand long-term economic dynamics as well as geographic variability. Continuing the project, we excavated 2 additional recent archaeological sites located in different environments and distant from the first site, Tunnel 7. We wanted to compare the systems of resource exploitation documented by the archaeological record with that described ethnographically, along with the current environmental differences. By noting the similarities and differences, we would be able to evaluate the cultural modifications and their causes. The research demonstrated general stability in the littoral ecosystems, with few changes in the resources exploited during the last 6,000 years, until the impact of industrial society. The variability observed in the recent sites was not conditioned by seasonal variation in resources present in the environment, but by slight differences in the local conditions of each habitat. The complete subsistence system could be described as one specialized towards the exploitation of littoral resources, but whose strategy toward one resource was not particularly specialized, a specialization in a non-specialized strategy. Until this point, the archaeological work served to describe the strategies of production. In addition, we already had some clear ideas about the Fuegian societies and the processes of their final disappearance. We understood that after 6,000 years of accumulated experience, they had achieved certain equilibrium between the population and its resource exploitation. We already knew that when the Europeans introduced fast changes, the social system ended up being less flexible than the subsistence strategies. The indigenous population quickly became aware and adopted the advantages of new materials and technologies. However, in contrast, the system of social reproduction did not have an opportunity to change. The impact of industrial exploitation of the marine resources by Europeans culminated in consequences such as sickness, population aggregation or dispersion, which together proved to cause catastrophic mortality. The society collapsed shortly after contact. But to identify those causes and complete our main objective, we still needed to confront the analysis of archaeological evidence related with social reproduction. We knew that the system was sustained by the inequality in social relations between men and women. This was of critical importance for maintaining the system, and the distribution of activities was specifically designed to reinforce the social roles that each sex had within Yamana society. And following that, we should be able to look for contexts directly connected with ideological reproduction. We found those contexts in the lands of the ancient Remolino Ranch, some 40 kilometers east of the city of Ushuaia. There, we excavated a human burial for its funerary contexts, as well as social and ideological contexts contained within the subjects. Those contexts showed us how buried individuals were modified by the activities that they accomplished in life and affected by possible dietary deficiencies, sicknesses overcome. Apart from the cause and age of death, other important information to identify is if there were differences in the people's lives relating to the division of labor, access to resources, and maintenance of the subsistence conditions and quality of life. The Yamana sepulchres recovered up to this point in Tierra del Fuego are highly variable. They corroborate with different ethnographic sources and signal that, according to the circumstances, they buried their dead in one type of site or another and with more or less grave goods. This demonstrates to us that what is called funerary ritual was not actually the important or definitive cause of these activities. The essential point is that Yamana society considered their dead susceptible to receive a special treatment. The treatment of the dead implies work on the part of the living. It is important to consider who did this work and how it was achieved. There is still the job to synthesize analysis of the evidence that is being recovered from Tierra del Fuego and to make general conclusions. At Remolino Ranch, we located a site that was described ethnographically by Father Martin Gusinde during the collective ceremony of Thea House. The site was located thanks to his detailed descriptions and photographs. The excavation of this ritual hut, already converted to an archaeological site, addresses the problem of changes that occurred to the site as a result of activities after its abandonment. These relate to the terrain's use as a working ranch and a military base. Only some traces of the activities undertaken within the structure could be recovered. The remains of a small hearth and the oval outline marked by evidence of poles that were sunk into the ground. It was very difficult to identify the remains of consumption actually connected with the structure. Nothing, aside from some fragments of pigment, stand out as ritual remains that are distinct from those related to normal consumption remains from a working ranch of the time. Archaeologically, the differences between common and ritual habitation structures would be in the size and form of the constructed huts and the deposition of few or no consumption remains. Definitively, if we generalize from this evidence, we should accept that it is very difficult to recognize a ritual enclosure of this type in prehistoric societies. Tierra del Fuego invites the possibility to look for archaeological differences between the distinct groups that European accounts report as inhabiting the island. However, the ethnographic information is contradictory in that people change their location, classification, and denomination over time. The differences were not very notable at the level of the artifacts, nor in the resources consumed. For the most part, those did not vary. However, in some cases, one can statistically identify weak metric or morphological tendencies of the artifacts, as well as distinct emphasis in the strategies of resource exploitation. These correspond with variation in the landscape. We were also able to compare between daily and special spaces in the group that occupied the northeastern portion of the same Isla Grande, that was ethnographically named Stelknam. The first investigation focused on a large hut that was still standing and where traditionally one of the last Hain rituals of the people from north was situated. To make comparison between that space and a daily one of the same society, the investigation proceeded with the excavation of the remains of a habitation structure that were located nearby. The materials recovered in the two sites are not qualitatively different, although the proportion of materials does vary. The analysis of their spatial internal distribution provides evidence for two different types of residue and space management. There are also differences in the dimensions of the huts, 6 meters compared with 3 to 4 meters in diameter, as well as their location on the landscape, inside or outside of the forest. Although there are differences between ritual and residential huts, using normal archaeological methods, these would be interpreted simply as a different use of space. The examples open the debate about the need to rethink the place that rituals of social reproduction play within the organization of daily life in hunter-gatherer societies, and also about how we understand what is ceremony or ritual. Above all, it demonstrates that in archaeology there still remains much to learn about the relations of social reproduction. Arriving at this point, we are able to return to the initial question.
Quindi pensate che l'archeologia possa rispondere a domande sull'organizzazione sociale delle antiche società?
Está claro a partir de nuestros trabajos que sí, pero hay que hacer una serie de cambios importantes.
¿Y quién serían los imprescindibles?
En cambio básico sobre las categorías que usamos para el análisis deben tener significado social de entrada.
It is essential to exchange some classic archaeological categories for others that have social significance. This permits one to relate production with consumption, or to connect the social reproduction with the consumption of goods.
Sí, pero hará falta adaptar o inventar nuevas técnicas o nuevas combinaciones de técnicas.
We should modify the common techniques, not segregate them, in addition to inventing new forms of inquiry to respond to new questions. It is very important to understand how the artifacts were made with the types of tools accessible to the people. Through this, one will be able to quantify the real value of the objects related to the strategies of resource management and of the effort invested in their production. One will also be able to detect how ideological forces interfere with the rationalization of the processes of work.
Tenemos que pensar en la experimentación como un instrumento más imprescindible y sobre todo integrado en el proceso de investigación.
A program of experimentation specifically designed for each concrete investigation is necessary to understand how the ethnographic descriptions relate to the archaeological record and its formation, as the simple ethnographic descriptions are insufficient to explain the causes of the observed examples.
Sin olvidarnos de excavar en toda su extensión diferentes espacios representativos socialmente.
We have verified the importance of achieving excavations that completely cover the areas occupied by a social unit. Only through that can one look for the horizontal spatial relations between the significant elements of the synchronical processes of production and consumption. One should also accomplish refittings to relate the information of the obvious structures and to statistically identify other possible connections within and between fine stratigraphic subunits.
Además, el método de excavación nos debe permitir identificar discontinuidades estratigráficas para así poder aislar momentos de posición más cortos.
Sí, hemos comprobado que eso puede hacerse, incluso en el caso de concheros. Y la información que vamos a obtener de esa forma es básica para nuestros cultivos.
Thanks to the technique of excavation, with a standardized analytical description of the sediment structure and their components, we have distinguished the fine stratigraphic subunits that can be the consequence of discrete moments of residue deposition. We were able to isolate successive occupations from within the same space to detect patterns of activity organization, as well as the recurrences and the variability along the sequence of occupation episodes. The results, confronting an archaeological work on a concrete society with the corresponding ethnographic data, obliges us to rethink about certain general elements that are critical for the study of hunter-gatherer societies, and at the same time has permitted us to put forth propositions to overcome the previous limits of archaeology. The traditional practice that looked for ethnographic reference to reinforce their induction is questionable because the ethnographic record is biased from its origin. It has changed its perspective. At the same time, it has homogenized, made more even and simplified the observations recorded. Direct induction about the organizational strategies from ethnography or assumptions that seem logical do not always correspond with reality. One cannot assume, for example, that sea lions were always hunted with a harpoon because it was the most adequate tool. People were able to adopt strategies that were much more flexible and opportunistic. The ethnographic studies reported by men, frequently missionaries, who were conditioned by a Victorian and Christian ideology, overlooked the discrimination and social inequalities of women as manifested through the sexual division of labor. For example, despite what is affirmed by most of the writings, the Fuegian people did not constitute an egalitarian society. Also, the universal existence of ethnic frontiers has been assumed without too much discussion. The boundaries may only be the projection of the view and determined assumptions of an anthropological school on certain societies. For those, there may not have existed territorial exclusivity, nor borders, nor discrete groups, but relations and exchanges of intensity and variable frequencies that produce the similarities or differences that appear between hunter-gatherer societies. Concluding, in the process of investigation, the ethnographic data can be useful in the stage of hypothesis formulation, but have to be contrasted with archaeological methods. All that obliges us to undertake from prehistoric archaeology the verification that includes those universals, like the sexual division of labor, that are most apparent. We should propose how to identify these characteristics archaeologically, to see how, when, and why they have been produced and maintained. Beginning with what we have learned from our experience, it has opened other requirements. These include the study of other societies in other environmental conditions who had managed strategies of distinct resources. In principle, we have chosen to study other societies that share, similar to the people of the Beagle Channel, the exploitation of littoral resources. We continue studying prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies that were our initial interest of departure. We will try to confirm that the significant differences between those societies is not based on an assumed or subjective ethnic definition. Neither is it based on the elements in which they based their survival, if they were shell collectors, terrestrial collectors, or hunters, but on how they were organized to reproduce their system and continue their form of exploitation of those resources. So, well, our methodological challenge continues.